we're going to look at the 10 top tips for narrative writing. Let's dive right into it. The first thing we need to determine is what is a narrative. And a narrative is a spoken or written account of connected events. In essence, a narrative for us would be a story. And we see a lot of stories, whether they're personal stories or actual stories or made-up stories. These are a part of our everyday lives, especially through some of the movies and TV shows that we watch often. So a narrative is something that we're pretty much familiar with. Here are 5 of the main elements of a narrative or of a story: setting, plot, theme, character, and conflict. I do have a video available that discusses all of the elements of a story. So I won't go into detail for each particular element, okay, in terms of presenting examples and stuff like that. If you need to refresh your memory on what the elements are and what the examples look like, you can refer to that video. But for today, setting is when and where the story takes place. Plot is the sequence of events. Theme is the central message or idea that the writer is trying to get us to understand or to take away from the story. Characters would be described as any animal, person, place, or thing that would take part in a particular story. And a conflict is a struggle or clash between 2 or more opposing forces. Let me just say that there are 2 types of conflict: internal and external. And an internal conflict is a conflict that we normally call it man versus self, and it is between a character and their inner thought. And that's why we call it man versus self. And the other one is external conflict. Now, with the external conflict, there are different types of external conflict. So you may have man versus man. Man versus society, where we have a particular person fighting against gender roles that are in place by society, or even racial roles. Okay? So there are different kinds of conflicts. We won't go into detail into that today, but I just wanted to point it out to you. So once you have an understanding of the 5 main types of, the 5 main elements of a story, student, it'll be very easy for you to not only be able to identify them within pieces, it'll be easier for you to be able to write them in your pieces as well, or incorporate them into your stories as well. So I suggest that as you're in class and you're reading some books, because a lot of you are in 9th and 10th grade, so you'd be reading, for example, the Skinner Men. As you're reading those books, I want you to make note of who the characters are. Not only who they are, but how they are developed. All right? I also want you to make note of the setting. Where is the story taking place? Where is the particular scene taking place? And how does that have an effect on the story or the mood or the message? So tip 1 for narrative writing. Start your essay with an attention-grabbing introduction. In essence, start your essay strong. And I have listed just 3 examples of introductions that you can use. The first one is the flashback introduction. This makes it clear that the story will go back in time. So with the flashback introduction, we start at the very end of the story, and then we go back to what would have happened to get us to that particular point or to that particular moment. And you will find that this particular opening might happen in season 2 of a series that we're watching, where they start at where they are, and then they go back into how they would have gotten there. So the flashback opening makes it clear that the story will go back in time. The second kind of opening that we're going to look at is the wham bam opening. And this kind of opening, it plunges the reader right into the action of the story. So we don't have that rising action. We start at the climax, and then we give our different events or scenarios as to how we got there. So it's almost like the flashback, but it doesn't go too much into detail. Okay? The supplied opening now is something that you will find will normally be presented on your paper. It's something that is provided in the examination. So the examiner might ask you to start your essay or your narrative by saying, I never thought the day would end. So that would be the supplied opening. And for most of the papers that you will look at or that you will see, will always have a supplied opening or ending for your narrative. Tip 2, use synonyms. And synonyms are words that mean the same or are similar in meaning to other words. And you will find that with our synonyms, they show the examiner that you not only know different words, but you know how to use them as well. Because sometimes when we pull a synonym to put it in a sentence, it might not make sense. So I want you to be careful of using synonyms. Yeah, we want you to use them, but we want you to use them correctly. Okay? So let's just look at the example. We walked in the hot sun. It's kind of vague. I cannot tell how hot the sun was. And it doesn't create any kind of imagery as to the atmosphere of that particular day. But if we replace hot with scorching, then as the reader of that particular paper, I can assume that it was very, very hot that day. And it wasn't just hot, it would have made the persons in the sun uncomfortable. So it's very important that when you're using your words, and I use this example because it shows you the different levels. So warm, hot, boiling, sizzling, scorching. Of course, if we said the water was scorching or we jumped into the scorching water, it wouldn't have the same effect. Okay, so it's very important that you pay attention to the words that you are selecting to replace other words. And be sure that the meaning is as close as possible to the original word that you used in that sentence. So let's look at this example. My dad went to work. So we're just going, of course, raced isn't a synonym for went, but we're putting a little bit more thought into what it is that we're writing. Okay? So, my dad raced to work. This has a little more effect to it. This here is a perfect example. Jane said she had a secret versus Jane whispered to Peter. Okay, so said and whispered, they are synonyms. It's very important, and I'll provide you with a list of synonyms that you can use, and of course said will be a part of that list. It's very important, students, that when you're writing your essay, that you use different words that mean the same as said. So whispered, stated, shouted, etc. Okay, so you want to vary your words. Here are some other examples of synonyms. Happy, content, joyous, jubilant, thrilled, And of course, based on how you are using it in a sentence, you'll know which word to select. So sad, sorrowful, cheerless, grievous, somber, mournful. Okay, this is just a list of synonyms to give you an idea of. Tip 3. Vary your sentences. Now, there are 4 types of sentences that we normally focus on in language, and these 4 types, they are based on purpose. So when we write a declarative sentence, we write a declarative sentence because our purpose there would be to make a statement. When we write an imperative sentence, we want to give a command. For an exclamatory sentence, we want to show extreme emotion. For our interrogative sentences, we want to ask questions. So, tip 3, it's very important that you include these different types of sentences within your essay. Essentially, the examiner does not want to read an essay with all declarative sentences. Okay, so it's very important that you vary the types of sentences that you use. Now, this is another kind of sentence that we look at, but when we look at this one, we refer to it as sentence structure type because they focus on the length. All right. A simple sentence is a sentence that will include one independent clause, and an independent clause is simply a group of words that express a complete thought. Now, our simple sentence will be a little shorter in length than the other types of sentence structures that we will look at. Our compound sentence will consist of 2 independent clauses, and we've already stated that an independent clause is a group of words that express a complete thought because, of course, it has a predicate and a subject, or a subject and a verb phrase as a part of it. But with the compound sentence, we use coordinating conjunctions to join our 2 independent clauses together. And I also have a lesson that goes into detail about the different types of sentences as well as sentence structure types. That lesson is called Super Sentences. You can also access that for an in-depth discussion as well as examples. Okay, but for today, we won't go into that. Our complex sentence now will include, of course, an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. Now, if an independent clause is a group of words that express a complete thought, then we can automatically assume that a dependent clause is a group of words that do not express a complete thought and something else has to be added to it to make it complete. Our compound complex sentence will normally consist of 2 independent clause, 1 dependent clause, and in some cases we'll have a coordinating conjunction or another kind of conjunction linking those clauses together. Now, these are just some examples of the sentences that we must use within our essays to show the examiner that we know that, hey, a simple sentence is just a shortened way of saying something, and a complex sentence, now, of course, it requires more work and a little bit more focus, but in the end, it will show the examiner that you know how to set up your words in a way that your thoughts will come across in a complete and concise manner. And it's very important, and I should have mentioned it in the beginning, but it's very important that when you're writing sentences, students, it's very important that you note to always begin your sentences with a capital letter and to end it with the correct punctuation mark. And I came back to this page because I want you to note that the declarative sentence and the imperative sentence, they Both end with the same punctuation mark, but their purpose is different, and that punctuation mark is the period. The exclamatory sentence, however, ends with an exclamation point, and our interrogative sentence will, of course, end with a question mark, okay? So when you're writing your sentences, please ensure that you begin them with capital letters and you end them with the correct punctuation at the end. But not only that, if you're writing a complex sentence or a compound complex sentence, please ensure that your commas or your semicolons are placed correctly. Now, here are a few questions that I want you to consider when you are writing your sentences. Are some of your sentences long and others short? Did you start your sentences differently? And do some of your sentences start with a different part of speech? For example, did you start some with a noun, or did you start some by saying Mrs. Myrtle and then changed it up and said she or her? It's very important that you vary how you begin your sentences. And that is a part of sentence variation as well. So what I have provided for you is also a few examples of how you can begin your sentences. Okay, so take 2 seconds and look at that. Tip 4, include dialogue. And dialogue is a conversation between 2 or more persons. The examiner does not want to read an essay with you just narrating what another person said. For example, you'll say, John told Sammy to close the door. Sammy closed the door, but she said back to John that she was upset. No. One way of not only showing how irate someone was or the kind of response that they gave is through dialogue. So I want to encourage you students to use dialogue. And here's the good thing about using dialogue within your essays, particularly for academic purposes. Dialogue is the only time you're able to use Bahamian dialect, or what we call Bahamianese or Bahamian Creole, without being penalized. Let's look at the example that's on the screen. You eat yet? Asked my mother from the bottom of the stairs. Now, as Bahamians, we know that you eat yet? We know that's the question. The did doesn't even have to be there because that is how we speak. And in this particular example, had this been placed on a paper, the student will not be penalized for not putting the did. Why? Because it's in quotation marks and it's a part of dialogue, it's a part of conversation. And we know that that is how we speak. Okay, so I want to encourage you, if Bahamian Creole is something that you want to be a part of your academic paper, particularly the BJC when you're writing, use it in dialogue. Okay? Tip 5. Use capital letters and punctuations. Now, I know I said that when we looked at tip 3, varying sentences, but I needed to have a separate point for that. There is no way that you should be writing your sentences without capitalizing the first word within that sentence. And even more so, there's no way you should be using proper nouns without capitalizing them as well. So I should not see, if I'm reading your essay, I should not see Mrs. Myrtle, all lowercase. No, because you're talking about a person, and this is probably where we need to look at parts of speech. Oh, I do also have a part of speech. It's not a video lesson, but I do have some notes posted on the page. So you can also go there and see the different parts of speech as well as examples that I have listed. But for this particular lesson, there are two kinds of nouns that we focus on, and it would be the common noun and the proper noun. The common noun would give us the general name of a person, place, thing, or idea. So the common noun for Mrs. Myrtle would be teacher, right? It doesn't specify which teacher we're talking about, whether the teacher is male, female, or any other information like that. Now, when we come now to our proper nouns give us the specific name of a person, place, thing, or idea. And that is why we begin our proper nouns with a capital letter. So if you're writing your essay and then you want to talk about Mrs. Myrtle, your teacher, you have to begin with a capital letter for both the Mrs., which would be the title, and the surname. Okay, so be mindful of that. And also, so in addition to using capital letters for the beginning of sentences and proper nouns, I also need you to remember to punctuate your sentences correctly. And this is, of course, not only for the end punctuation, but also with knowing when to use a colon as opposed to a semicolon, or knowing when to use a semicolon instead of a comma. And even more importantly, so when we come, I know we talked about using dialect or dialogue, It's very important for you to know where to put your quotation marks, and we'll have a separate talk on that. Tip 6, we talked about using sentences, we talked about using punctuation and capitalizing our letters, but this is very, very important. It's very important that you use paragraphs. And we know that a paragraph would be a group of sentences that are based on a particular thought or a particular topic. Now, in the narrative, you might find it slightly difficult to determine how to break or divide or separate your essay. But I would say to you, it's very important that you either try to determine if you're going to use the speaker. Let's just say your essay has more than one speaker within it, or more than one setting. You try to determine how you're going to separate. There is no reason or no reasonable explanation as to why there would be students writing essays in one paragraph. Okay, so that's something we can also talk about, paragraphing. So tip 7, use figurative devices. The narrative essay is possibly the only essay that you can write and include figurative devices, because the expository essay it's an essay based on facts and an explanation. And although you might include one or two figurative devices within it for effect, the narrative essay is essentially the essay that you should use the figurative devices in to not only bring out some of the setting, but to also bring about some of the action or experiences of the characters as well. So it's very, very important that when you're writing your narrative, you try to include some figurative devices. Now, I also have a lesson entitled Literal and Figurative. You can go on that and watch it to see what it means when a word is used figuratively and when it is used literally. So you can have an understanding of figurative language. But a simile is a comparison between two unlike things using like or as, and that doesn't mean that because like or as is in the sentence it's simile. For example, I like to eat chocolate. No, I like to eat chocolate is not a simile, it's just a regular sentence, okay? So I need you to know the difference between regular sentences and similes. Metaphor. A metaphor is a comparison between two unlike things. The only difference between a simile and a metaphor is that the simile has like or as a part of the comparison. Alliteration is another figurative device, and that's something that we would have seen. I don't know if you would have read The Skin I'm In, but that is something that you would have seen throughout The Skin I'm In. And alliteration is the repetition of the same sound or the same initial sound at the beginning of words. And onomatopoeia is any word that imitates sounds. So, for example, buzz, pop, and tick. So there are words that you might want to include into your essay for effect as well. So instead of saying the bee flew around the room, the bee buzzed around the room. So as the reader, I can assume that the bee was not only there, but the noise might have been irritating or distracting to the person there. So it's very important that you not only vary your words, not only vary your sentences, not only use punctuation. It's very important that you also include figurative devices as a part of your narrative as well. So let's look at this example. Susan exercised. Okay. It's kind of vague, right? But let's look at the example. The sweat danced down Susan's forehead as she continued to do 100 steps. Sorry about that. So let me read that again. The sweat danced down Susan's forehead as she continued to do 100 sit-ups. Now, we did not look at this particular figure of speech in our example. This is an example of personification where we give an inanimate object human-like qualities. So, sweat dance, that's an example of personification. Okay? Tip 8. So remember at the beginning of this session when we talked about elements of a story? Remember that character was a part of it. So you're not just throwing characters into your story, you're developing those characters as well. And many times when we not only read books, but when we watch TV shows and movies, we see that the author not only in some instances tell us how they want us to think about a particular character by saying he is mean or he was spiteful. They give us qualities or personality traits. They might sometimes use the character's thought, actions, choices, speech, or their physical appearance to assist us in determining how this particular character is. So when we read The Skin I'm In, Sharon Clay, she doesn't only tell us how a particular character is or how she wants us to feel about a particular character. She also displays who they are through what they say and do, particularly how they treat other people. For example, Charlie. Okay, how Charlie treats Malika. Tip 9. Be descriptive. Be descriptive. Add vividness to your story, and one way to do that is to include sensory details. And sensory details are basically those things that appeal to our five senses. They appeal to our ability to smell, hear, taste, feel, and see. And it's very important for you to use sensory details because it allows some of the information, or it allows your story to be memorable, and in some cases it allows the reader to understand the true meaning because they're able to experience it through their five senses. So let's look at some examples. Taste. One bite of the sour lemon caused my lips to pucker. Sound. The car squeaked every time I hit a bump in the road. Sight. The tiny red ant climbed up the broken twig. Smell. The sweet smell of freshly baked apple filled the air. And touch. The sharp edge of the paper cut my finger and made it sting. Just a few examples of how to be descriptive. And the last tip for today, use an ending. Remember when we started our session, we talked about using an opening? Yeah, please ensure that when you're done with your essay, you write an ending that either is one, a cliffhanger, it creates an unfinished effect. And this is kind of like what we normally see with TV shows. So in order for the writer or the director to keep us interested in what will come in the next episode, they leave something unfinished. Okay, so the cliffhanger is that particular ending that says to the reader, I know the writer didn't conclude, but in the event there is a second portion, some of the conflicts that are in this particular piece can be resolved in that second piece. Okay? The second kind of ending and there are more endings, so we're only looking at two, would be the definite ending. And this particular ending is a cliched ending because it's something that we've seen over and over and over again. And we can also call this the traditional ending. So let's just say at the end of your story, you want everyone to live happily ever after. That would be considered a cliche because we've seen it 1,000 times before. Not that it'll cause you to lose points, but it's just something that we expect. Okay? So thank you so much. Thank you.